I'd like to attribute it to some outside force or factor. I, the truth is, it's me. I, I grew up in the 60s, an age of turbulence and defiance and rebellion. And so I think I can legitimately say in my history, I went through that. And so certainly it had some effects on me. But as a 67-year-old man, I still find it difficult to hear a command and think, oh, I want to follow every command. I kind of don't. I resist following commands. Well, that's unfortunate. And part of the reason it's unfortunate is because some commands are for not just my good, but for the good of us all. And oh, by the way, there are commands that whether you like them or not, you got to do what they say. Ultimately, for me, there is a hierarchy of commands, and the ultimate tier of importance, significance, the ultimate compelling factor would be any command that God has given. And John, the apostle, writes about a new command when he writes in 1 John chapter 2, and we talked a little bit about it yesterday. He in verse 8 says, "Yet I am writing you a new command." Well, my view is, and part of the reason is, I don't see a command as he's talking about this. He doesn't give any substance to the command. I think what he's doing is pointing back to the new command that Jesus gave. There was with his disciples on the night of his betrayal, and he said to them, this is in John chapter 14, "A new command I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you." We already talked about how Jesus, previous to that, had summarized, I won't say reduced, but he had summarized the law and the prophets with two commands: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then with the disciples, on that night, the night of the Last Supper, a new command, that you love one another as I have loved you. And that summarizes, that is the ultimate directional command for every follower of Christ for all time. That John puts it this way earlier in chapter 2 here, verse 6, "Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did," which is additional weight on this idea of the new command that we would love one another as Christ himself has loved us. And then in verse 9, he writes, "Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness." We talked about this, the contrast of light and darkness. John uses contrast and if then a whole lot throughout his writing here. And here is a significant contrast, light and dark. The moral darkness of disobedience and the moral light of obedience. Well, if we claim to be in the light, but we hate our brother or sister, we're still in the darkness. Okay, there is we talked about this a little bit last time. You have to define what hatred is, okay? Is hatred the same thing as dislike? It's a degree of darkness and gray and so forth. There's nobody and nothing that I hate that I don't dislike. I think, though, there are things and people that I dislike but don't hate. Am I just kind of letting myself off the hook? No, I don't think so. I think that distinction is important. it is not an option. One of the ways to maybe paraphrase what John says here is, it is not an option for a follower of Christ to hate anyone. You see, hatred has to do with a desire to see them harmed, or a desire to harm them ourselves. Is that the same thing as desiring justice, when justice would require that person to be punished? I don't know. See, now we're down on the level of motive. Oh, that's where we've always been. You see, this hatred thing is a motive deal. What is my motive? What is my bottom line motive? My bottom line attitude, thinking, and even feeling toward a brother or a sister? Now, I've been in the church. Well, I don't remember the first time I was in church, because it was probably a week after I was born. What I do remember from growing up is, if I didn't have a fever of 112 and was not bleeding from any important organ, I was there. Come hell or high water, snow, rain, sunshine, cold, hot, it didn't matter. I was in church. That's how it is when you're a PK, preacher's kid. In my career and my experience as a preacher's kid, and in my career as a preacher, as a minister and a pastor, there have been a lot of people who I found disagreeable. You know, I've not liked everybody that I've connected with and have been in contact with in God's church. I'm a wretch. I didn't like everybody. Everybody didn't. There were some people there that I had bad chemistry with. We disagreed, and we at times didn't even disagree agreeably. Well, I wish I could change that. And I do make effort to change as best I can my approach to people that I don't agree with. But see, is that the same thing as hating them? No. Now, honestly, in my immaturity, I'll be honest with you, there are things they did to me that I hated. There are effects of their brokenness that I see in other people that I hate, but I don't hate them. There are a lot of times in my immaturity that they would do or say things toward me, and in my disagreement with them, my thought was, wow, I wish you would come around to what's right. And if you need to know what that is, just ask me and I can tell you. If they didn't think like me, if they didn't decide the way I decided, if they didn't decide on what I decided, then, But still, that's not hate. To hate is a very significant thing. We live in the year 2020, regardless of which side of the political spectrum you hang out on. We live in an age of contention and hatred. And if you take my word for it, if you don't go on social media and see these things for yourself, 10 minutes on Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media you would engage with will tell you there's just hatred in every direction. That won't work for a follower of Christ. But now, when I say that, I want you to make sure you understand what I mean by that. Yes, I can take exception with the party other than the party that I've aligned with. I can be critical of them, and I can be openly and sternly critical of them. Honestly, I can hate some of the things that they stand for, but I cannot hate the people. That is outside the boundaries of God's design. I cannot reflect His nature and hate them. And this is harsh. This is a difficult thing to deal with, and you have to be careful. I have to be careful. There's sometimes I don't split hairs and think, they stand for things that I just hate, and I know God hates. I would love it if they would get what's due them. Because now am I not creeping over toward hatred when I do that? At the very least, I'm creeping toward malice. Well, you cannot hate your brother and sister and walk in the light. It isn't possible. That's a lot of words for what John wrote in verse 9. And then he goes on in verse 10 with the contrast, another, flip the coin. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. I don't need to say very much about the idea of if they love, they're walking in the light. That makes sense. I mean, that's the contrast. Walk in darkness, walk in light. Okay, and then he says there is nothing for those who are walking in the light. They demonstrate this by loving their brothers and sisters. They walk in the light, and he says there is nothing. Well, they live in the light. In Scripture, to walk in a symbolic way means to live. And there is nothing in them that makes them stumble. Notice that this is an internal thing, not an external thing. It's not like John is saying they walk in the light and so there won't be anything out there that'll make them stumble. No, it is there's nothing in them that would make them stumble. This is incredible. And this is huge. And he is not talking about physically stumbling. He's talking in metaphors here. He's talking symbolically, almost poetically. He's saying, when you love your brothers and your sisters, then you live in the light, and there's nothing in you that will cause you to stumble. There's nothing in you. There's no darkness that will hinder you, that will trip you up. I would love it. See, my life, I have a lot of things, external things that trip me up. But the things that most often trip me up have nothing to do with outward circumstances and outward influences and, things that originate outside of me. It's mainly things in me. And if I want to assure myself of walking well, living well, and if I could live without stumbling, would that not be living well? Of course it would. Well, here's the key. Love my brothers and my sisters. Love them. Desire for them their greatest good, and do whatever I can to help them discover and achieve it, or before that, discover the good in them, discover God's design in them so that they can learn how to live into and express His design. And I've told you this before, that's the motto of my counseling practice, helping you find your best life, which is found in God's design for you. So my role is to help people discover God's design and to live it out. Well, anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there's nothing in them to make them stumble. Now he goes back, another contrast. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they're going because the darkness has blinded them. Well, he just states it and restates it, and then he says it again. Here's the thing. There's darkness and there's light. And the line of demarcation between the two is love or hate. Well, there's so much to do with that, and John talks more about it. So we'll engage with that as we move along next time on So Care with Stevie Boy. I hope we get to connect this way then.